What is evil? Is there such a thing? Is evil real? Not all theologians think it is. Take Augustine, for example. Many people regard him as the most influential theologian of all time. He defined evil as simply the absence of good. He saw it as a sort of emptiness. It was the absence of God. And since God is everywhere, that meant that evil isn't really there at all. Other theologians saw it differently. For them, evil was a tangible force, a force of destruction, a force of intentional maliciousness and harm. Who's right? Is there such a thing as evil or not? For example, have you ever actually met a person who you consider to be evil? Is evil real? For a long time, I asked these questions of everyone I knew. The responses were eye-opening. One of the things that I found most surprising was that of the people I talked to, most of those who said that they did not believe in God did believe in evil. They could believe in a force for bad, but not one for good. I wonder why. How about you? What do you think? I wish I had time to hear your responses. Please tell me later if you get a chance. Behind all these questions, of course, was my own uncertainty. I wanted to hear what other people thought because I wasn't sure what my own opinion was. I'm still puzzled. And yet I've been helped by looking at what psychologists have to say about it. Of course, psychologists don't actually use the word evil. They have another word for people whose actions demonstrate a consistent pattern of intentional maliciousness. The term they use is sociopath, or sometimes psychopath. And about that, they have a lot to say. A sociopath is defined as a person entirely without a conscience. And it turns out that there are far more of these than any of us would like to believe. The fact is, sociopaths make up 4% of the entire population. That works out to be 1 in every 25 people, which means that it is, in fact, an absolute certainty that all of us have at one time or another known at least one psychopath in the course of our lives, probably many. The thing is, we might not know it. Sociopaths can be very charming. In their efforts to manipulate people, they watch others closely to learn what they have to do to wrap them around their little finger. Many are highly successful at this, and highly successful in other ways too. In fact, the 2 places where you are most likely to find sociopaths are, first of all, among the long-term inmates of maximum security prisons. That's not so surprising. But what about the second? The second place you're most likely to find sociopaths are among the top group of our nation's CEOs, the leaders of the nation's major corporations. In other words, sociopaths are found wherever there's greed, wherever there's cutthroat competition, wherever there's backstabbing as a tool of the trade. Some go about it in very crude ways. Others do it with elegant finesse. But there's one trait that every sociopath shares with all the others. They are all compulsive liars. They lie constantly, nonstop. As I say, we've all known at least one sociopath. As for me, well, As many of you know, I worked for a number of years as a hospital chaplain. As part of my job, I regularly taught a course on medical ethics at the nursing school attached to the hospital. The course involved a lot of discussion, and as a result, I got to know the students very well. Among them all, there was one in particular who I'll never forget. I'll call him Steve. Steve really stood out. He was smart and funny and took an active part in the course. I liked him, and I was convinced that he would do well as a nurse. I was caught completely off guard then when I was asked to be part of a group of faculty to investigate charges that Steve had sexually harassed another student. Our job as faculty was to interview all involved, including those who would be acting as character witnesses. I agreed to do it, but I was sure that there must be some mistake. I was convinced that a guy as smart and as likable as Steve couldn't have done what he was accused of doing. Those of us acting as judges started by interviewing Steve. And as he spoke, I grew more and more convinced that the complaint against him must just have been the result of a misunderstanding. Steve was just so sincere. He expressed real concern for the woman who had brought the charge. He was so appealing in his warmth and his puzzlement that anything he had said or done could possibly have been misconstrued in some way that had hurt her. He was so convincing in all that, in everything he said. Yes, I thought when he had finished his testimony, there must have been a mistake. Surely the woman had misunderstood him in some way. That had to be the case. Next, we interviewed the young woman who had brought the charge. I'll call her Mary. The first thing I noticed about Mary was how reluctant she was to actually accuse him. I really don't want to get anyone in trouble, she kept saying. It turned out, in fact, that she had only come forward at all because she had told a couple of her friends about what happened, and they had convinced her to bring a complaint against Steve in order to protect other women. Those of us interviewing her had to drag her testimony out of her. Little by little it emerged, though, and the more she told, the worse it got. According to her, there hadn't been just one time when Steve had approached her with lewd suggestions, as Steve himself had implied. Instead, it had happened again and again and again. In fact, as by Mary's account, Steve had been stalking her. He approached her, he appeared to watch for instances when she would be alone, then he'd come up to her suddenly in a leering, insinuating manner that was clearly meant to be threatening, and he'd press himself upon her while making coarse, challenging suggestions. Mary said that she had always clearly and firmly rejected him and asked him to stop approaching her in this way, but he never did. The two testimonies were so far apart that it was clear that this could not be a matter of misunderstanding. One or the other of them had to be lying, and yet both seemed so sincere. So we turned to the character witnesses. All who came forward were as reluctant to cause trouble as Mary had been. They seemed so sad to be saying what they were about to report, and yet little by little a certain pattern developed. All agreed that Steve was charming, but one after another they started telling about things that Steve would do when they were that were less than honest, little thefts, statements that turned out to be clearly false. One young man named Tom summed it up. You know, he said, shaking his head sadly, Steve seems like such a great guy. But the longer you know him, the more you come to see that you can't trust him. Whenever he thinks that he can get away with it, he does things that are not so nice. And he lies constantly. He lies right in your face. Mary, on the other hand, she's as honest as the day is long. You can trust anything she says. Well, by then, the situation was looking pretty grim. Steve had begun to appear not simply as a misogynist, but as a potentially dangerous predator. And yet, it was still possible we were mistaken. As a result, we decided to interview Steve one last time. Steve had heard none of the testimony against him. So we one by one began to raise some of the new concerns that had come out. Oh, no, he said, and laughed, that warm, connecting way he had. They've got it all wrong. He then went on to relate an alternate account of what had happened that would have been entirely plausible, except for one thing. It did not fit any of the other facts that we had by now been verified by many others, but which Steve didn't realize that we knew. I'll never forget the chill that went through me as I heard him continue his tale. He did it with such conviction, such ease, such confidence. And yet, as I watched him, I thought, he's lying. He's been lying all along. This nice guy stuff is all just an act. He's playing a role. The fact is, Steve is a coldly calculating manipulator, a compulsive liar. What's more, he's at least a sexual predator and probably a predator in other ways too. He does it because he thinks he can get away with it, and he almost did. He took me in entirely. He's clearly a sociopath, and a dangerous one at that. That experience with Steve was a revelation. Since then, I've had no doubt that the statistics about sociopaths are correct. I now know that such people exist and that all are out to no good. In other words, it seems clear to me that there is evil in the world. It is found in people without consciences who see all others as either tools to be used or barriers to be crushed. They are people skilled at manipulating others, and they do it by using the trust and good intentions of ordinary people against them. Look, for example, at how the devil, the king of psychopaths, of sociopaths, tempts Jesus. He does it by suggesting that he doesn't do it by suggesting that Jesus do anything overtly evil. He knows that Jesus won't be tempted by anything that appears evil. Instead, he tempts Jesus to deviate from his mission by doing things that appear to be good. First, the devil tempts Jesus to turn stones to bread. By suggesting this, the devil isn't just offering Jesus a way to satisfy his own hunger, which must have been very severe after 40 days of fasting. Instead, he was actually hinting that Jesus could satisfy all hunger for everyone. I mean, think about it. Once Jesus has started turning stones into bread, why would he stop? Just picture how many stones there are in Israel's rocky desert soil. Jesus could have ended all hunger for centuries to come. Next, the devil tempts Jesus with the power that would have allowed him to finally bring justice into the world. After all, after that, Satan tempts Jesus to perform the sort of flamboyant miracle that would be sure to bring him instant fame and make it clear to all the world who he was. All of these sound perfectly fine, but they all have one thing in common. They all bring about a good end for the wrong reason. The end justifies the means. That's the argument the devil always uses when tempting good people to do bad things. Jesus wasn't fooled, though. The end doesn't justify the means. It doesn't work that way. Lies don't conquer lies. Truth does. Vengeance doesn't counter crime. Restorative justice does. Hatred doesn't counter hatred. Love does. The fact is, Jesus not only knew that there is evil in the world, he also knew how it works. We need to know that too. Jesus was able to recognize a sociopath when he saw one. He was able to see a compulsive liar for what he was. He had Satan's number, and so was able to counter him move for move. We need to learn this too. And as always, Jesus can show us the way. We need this now more than ever. Now when lies and so-called alternate truth have become rampant, we need to know that although there may be even evil in the world, there is also truth. That truth that is solid, truth that we can depend on. That truth is found in Jesus. With him, we can reject the lies. With him, we can hold fast to what is true. With him, we have a power far, far greater than any evil. With him, evil loses. With him, love wins. Amen.